procurement and outsourcing strategies for the supply chain. Um, excuse me. We are aware that outsourcing has become a fairly commonplace activity in supply chain networks, and over the last several decades, it is quite pervasive. So you could find it in just about any kind of industry that you look into. Some have been outsourcing for quite some time. For example, your Nikes that do the design and marketing, but actually subcontract manufacturing or outsource the manufacturing to places like Indonesia and so forth. In the electronics industry, that's very, very common, where Cisco uses basically major suppliers all around the world. Apple itself does the design of its products, but also not only outsources its components, but outsources manufacturing as well in China. So outsourcing is quite a common form of activity. But not only is the actual manufacturing outsourced, you now have people even outsourcing designs as well. So Taiwanese companies, for example, now design and manufacture several different types of laptops. And then you have Hewlett Packard and Palm One collaborate with Asian suppliers on the design of their personal devices. So essentially, companies look for competitive advantage, they look for opportunities, and outsourcing helps to provide that. So there are some questions when you're attempting to decide whether or not to go ahead with outsourcing. There are a couple of questions to consider. What are the risks involved? What kind of innovation is available to you? What kind of product characteristics you have, and whether or not the product characteristics allow you to really gain value from the outsourcing relationship that you would develop. So, make or buy decision is a typical example. So make if you do it internally, but if you buy it, then you're outsourcing essentially. And so there are typical risks associated with that. And so one needs a framework for actually doing the analysis of make or buy decisions. In terms of procurement, again, depending on the product structure, the market structure, there's often a need for kind of a framework to identify what is the appropriate procurement strategy. So there has to be some sort of link between the procurement or outsourcing strategy and the competitive strategy. But not only that, procurement and outsourcing are actually linked as well. And then in terms of how you go about procuring, the process itself, nowadays we see the emergence of a lot of e-marketplaces where you have companies coming together either to form consortiums that then allow suppliers to supply them, or that you have independent public or private marketplaces where you have consolidators who would create a portal and give access to multiple suppliers. In other words, the companies are actually going to that aggregator and then or the e-marketplace and then finding access to multiple suppliers. So you do have a couple of different models that we'll talk about. So what are some of the benefits that come out of outsourcing? One is that because you are removing non-core activities outside of the organization, sometimes you may very well get some economies of scale because if you have multiple, if you are a global organization and you outsource the production of your product or whatever it is, as an example, to one supplier where the demand actually comes from multiple markets, then you're doing some aggregation of that demand, and therefore you get some benefits from economies of scale. All right. So aggregating multiple orders helps to reduce costs both in purchasing and manufacturing. Risk pooling happens again if you have multiple markets and each market have a certain level of uncertainty. Then you move that uncertainty out of the organization to your suppliers and let them deal with uncertainty in demand. And so you get some risk pooling that happens as a result of that. And of course, if you move a chunk of your non-core activities to a supplier, then you could help to reduce the amount of capital investment necessary to provide support for those activities or those functions. So now that is actually transferred out to your suppliers. All right. There are some benefits, of course. One is the focus on core competencies, and that's often the argument that is given that companies are able to zero in on what their core capabilities are. And then you have some increased flexibility that happens where if you have a supplier who is better skilled at responding to changes in demand patterns and so on, that they allow you to better be able to react to changes in customer requirements. All right? And of course, given that the provider has better technical knowledge than your own organization, then they are also better able to respond to changes in terms of customer requirements. So anytime there's some new technologies that come on the market, they're able to adapt and adopt several of these new technologies into their operations because that is part of their core business. Right? But there are some risks associated with outsourcing. One has to be careful not to outsource critical components because in doing so, you provide an opportunity for the supplier to perhaps either backward engineer the product design, or they could actually do some forward integration into the retail space and then compete. So there's, of course, the issue of trust remains again when we talk about procurement and outsourcing relationships. Right? So outsourcing, while it does provide some benefits, the care must be taken not to outsource core functions or even functions that are critical to core functions, which then which then increases the level of risk to the buyer in the outsourcing relationship. Sometimes there could be some conflicting objectives between the buyer and the vendor who's providing the service to the buyer. Demand issues. So in a good economy, demand is high. Conflict can be addressed by buyers who are willing to make long-term commitments to purchase minimum quantities and so on. So when things are good, you could actually enter into arrangements where you make sort of a long-term partnership arrangements. But in a slow economy, if there's significant decline in demand, it's a lot more difficult to get into these long-term long-term commitments. The buyer is actually going to take a significant financial risk because they're not sure that they're going to be able to sell whatever they're committing to purchase. Right? In some cases, product design issues, the buyers may insist on flexibility, but then the suppliers are actually typically concerned about their costs and may not want to make too many dramatic modifications if it means that it actually drives their cost of production. Particularly if you've agreed to a particular price structure or cost structure, and now if the buyer is demanding changes, then clearly the arrangement would have to be renegotiated. Okay? So how can we decide, what is the framework for make-or-buy decisions? And the firm has to make the decision as to whether or not to outsource. If it decides to make it, then that means that the function is kept internally. If it decides to buy it, it's actually purchasing that capability outside. So how can it decide what is core and what is not core? There are a couple of things to consider. One is capacity and knowledge and the level of dependency. So is the buyer dependent on capacity? So they have knowledge, but they don't have the capacity, in which case they purchase just the capacity from the vendor. Or do they actually depend on the vendor's knowledge? Okay? So in the case of dependency on capacity, the firm has knowledge and skills required to produce the component, but for some reason they decide to outsource to gain extra capacity. In the other case of knowledge, dependency on knowledge, the firm does not have the people, skills, and knowledge required and outsources to gain access to that knowledge. All right? We see Toyota decided, in terms of their decisions to outsource, they have quite a number of outsourcing relationships. About 30% of components are in-sourced. That means that they actually make those. But in terms of the engines, they have the knowledge, and 100% of the engines are produced internally. So there's no outsourcing when it comes to that. But in terms of transmissions, the company has knowledge, it designs all the components, but it has some dependency when it comes to capacity. And so 70% of those transmissions are actually outsourced. Things like bumpers as well are also outsourced. The electronic systems is designed and produced by Toyota's suppliers. So the company has dependency on both capacity and knowledge in that regard. Okay? So it tends to vary, the company tends to vary how it outsources depending on the strategic role of the components. And that's what any company has to do, is to examine what is the role of that particular component. If that component is strategic in nature, then you want to certainly insource it. If the component is not strategic, then you may actually give consideration to the possibility of outsourcing. The decision also depends on the product architecture. Modular products and integral products are two types or two classification schemes that are used, and they have different implications for the viability of outsourcing. If the product is modular, then essentially you're combining components that off the shelf. So a computer, for example, is a modular product where you could combine the chassis with the motherboard, with the hard drive, and so on. So it's a configurable product. That's why mass customization actually works in this case. But when it comes to the integral product, then those functionalities are quite tightly related. They're not made from off-the-shelf components. They're designed as a system, taking a top-down approach, and they're evaluated on performance, not components. So the components perform multiple functions. You cannot simply just mix and match and create a product from that situation. The following table sort of provides a framework for making make or buy decisions. So if we look at the two categories of product types, modular versus integral, and the status of the two variables in terms of the dependency on capacity versus the dependency on knowledge, then we get a couple of different options. So let's just look at, in the case of a modular item, if there is dependency on both knowledge and capacity, then outsourcing is risky. And that is actually the same for integral products, because if you depend too heavily on a supplier for both capacity and the knowledge, what is stopping the supplier from actually producing that product themselves and becoming a competitor? If you are independent, if the buyer is independent for knowledge, that means they have the knowledge but don't have the capacity, then outsourcing is certainly an opportunity. It's an opportunity for modular products. It's an option for integral products. You could still perhaps produce the product internally. For an integral product, however, for a modular product, it might make more sense to consider outsourcing that particular item. If you are independent for both knowledge and capacity, there is an opportunity to consider some cost reductions through outsourcing for modular products. However, for an integral product, if you are totally independent for capacity and knowledge, why would you outsource an integral product? So it makes sense to just keep that internally. Okay. There are some factors to consider in whether or not to outsource. One is the customer importance. And if the product is extremely important to a customer, of course, it does not make sense to outsource, because it means that that particular product has core value, competitive value to you. The component clock speed, how fast does the component technology change over time? If it changes very, very quickly, I think the question of whether or not you want to put that in the control of a supplier versus actually taking control of that yourself is an important question. The competitive position, does the firm have a competitive advantage producing this component? So if they have a competitive advantage producing the component, you don't want to outsource because you will lose that competitive advantage. Do you have capable suppliers? If you have a lot of suppliers, then outsourcing can be certainly an opportunity, because they could compete and you could sort of get some benefit by having different suppliers competing for business. However, if you have fewer suppliers, then it's a lot riskier. You now depend your dependency level on that one supplier goes up. So therefore, the relationship becomes a bit more risky. And of course, the architecture of the product, which is how modular or integral that product is, because it has implications for whether or not it makes sense to outsource or not. If we look at a couple different examples here and exploring the various criteria, if a product is important to a customer, has high clock speed, so changes are very frequent, competitive advantage, it offers that. You do have, maybe you don't have capable suppliers in architecture. It is basically modular, or the architecture could be integral, it doesn't matter. Then it makes sense to do this in-house because it's very important to the customer, that product. So in other words, it's a core product. But if it's not important and the clock speed is very low, it doesn't provide any competitive advantage, it makes sense to outsource it. And then if it's important to the customer, the clock speed is high, but there's no competitive advantage to it, it might make sense to actually do it in-house or acquire a supplier who could actually do it or establish some kind of relationship. The idea here is to actually gain as much control as possible because the product is in fact important. So whenever a product is important, you do want to gain a lot of control. If the product is important, but the clock speed is slow, it doesn't change that much, doesn't really offer a whole lot of competitive advantage, then it makes sense to outsource if it is modular, right? Or in-source or producing in-house with some kind of joint development strategy. So in other words, you're working collaboratively with the supplier to consider producing it either jointly or you could actually do it in-house. So all the options actually make sense. And part of the reason why you would still consider in-sourcing here is because the product is actually important to the customer. So you notice in all the cases where the product is important to the customer, we want to consider in-sourcing as a possibility, okay? So in terms of determining what is the appropriate strategy for procurement, so we want to talk a bit about procurement. It depends on a few factors. One, what kind of product are you purchasing? The level of risk in terms of suppliers, how much uncertainty there is involved in terms of the demand. And so the firm must consider how it can create an effective purchasing strategy that is cognizant of all of these factors. What kind of capabilities are needed, the drivers of effective procurement, and how can the firm ensure that it will not have interrupted supply, in other words, continuous supply, without increasing its risk. So these are some issues or factors that needs to be considered. So there is a matrix that allows us to determine what a good procurement strategy is. It's called Kraljic Supply Matrix. And it depends on two core variables. One is called a profit impact, which has to do with if the product has a high profit impact, it means that there is a good margin between the sale value of the item and its cost structure. And perhaps there's fairly large volumes of sales and so on. So it contributes a lot to the profit margin. The supply risk has to do with the availability of suppliers. If there are a lot of suppliers, then your supply risk is low. But if you have very few suppliers, the supply risk can be very high. And so we could create this sort of two-dimensional matrix where we look at the supply risk versus the profit impact and then come up with some classifications. If the profit impact is low and the supply risk is low, then this is a non-critical item. So if it's a non-critical item, you don't expend too much energy in procurement. So try to automate the procurement process where you could say on a monthly basis, you order a certain quantity. And so that becomes a very simple process to manage. However, if the profit impact is low, but the supply risk is high, then we call that a bottleneck item. And you want to maintain or you want to ensure a certain consistency in your supply. So you would have to negotiate, obviously, with the few suppliers that are there to get some constancy of supply. If the profit impact is high, but the supply risk is low, so the product does provide good profit. However, it turns out that there's not a lot of risk in terms of the supply. What that means is that you have multiple people who could potentially supply you. So if you have purchasing power, you try to find a way to minimize your costs by leveraging those items, since they produce high profit, but the supply risk is low. There are many possible suppliers. And then if the profit impact is very high, but the supply risk is very high, you need to enter into a strategic partnership with those suppliers, the few suppliers that are available. And so we call those strategic items. So this framework sort of helps you to understand how you ought to treat the different categories of products. So in the top right quadrant, which we saw, strategic items, the supply risk is very high. So highest impact on customer experience, price is a large portion of the system's cost, and then you typically have a single, maybe two suppliers of that much. So you focus on long-term relationships with that supplier. On the bottom right quadrant, then the items have high impact on profit but low supply risk. So you leverage the item, many suppliers, small percentage of cost savings will have a large impact on the bottom line. So focus on trying to reduce your costs in terms of how you relate with these suppliers. And the left top quadrant, where essentially the supply risk is high, but the profit impact is quite low. So those items are bottleneck because it might be very difficult to actually obtain them. Even they do not contribute a large portion of the product costs. Suppliers have power in this case because there are few of them, so ensure some kind of continuous supply. Even at a possible premium cost, you might have to actually pay for that consistency in the supply. So focus on long-term contracts by carrying stock or both. And the bottom left quadrant is a non-critical, so you try to automate the process to try to drive costs out of that particular system. Marshall Fisher came up with an interesting model that looked at how products should be treated in terms of the supply chain, whether or not if, products should be engaged in a responsive supply chain versus a sort of a cost-efficient or an efficient supply chain. And to determine that, he looked at a couple of characteristics that allow one to determine whether or not a product is considered functional or innovative. So if the clock speed is low, and the demand is fairly predictable, so like tires, they don't change that much. The demand is fairly stable. A lot of grocery items fall into that category. Low profit margins, there's not a lot of product variety. Even the forecast errors can be fairly low. Stock out rate is also low. We call those functional products. So those products are fairly predictable, and essentially you want to emphasize reduction of costs. Because the profit margin is so low, you could impact the profit margin by trying to drive costs down. When products have a much faster clock speed, that means they change a lot faster, and the demand characteristics are such that demand is highly volatile or unpredictable, with high profit margin, high variety, high forecast error, then we call those innovative products. And innovative products that have fairly short development lead times, they're very hard to predict. And so therefore, they require a highly responsive kind of a supply chain to manage them. And if you look, you see examples of functional products, diapers, soap, soap as well too, milk. So you focus on what we call efficiency, reducing costs, whereas in terms of innovative products like fashion items, cosmetics, high-tech products, then in this case you will focus much more on a pull system as opposed to a push system for functional products, in which case you focus on response. All right, and those two different types of orientations to the supply chain becomes quite important. Okay. So we see functional products in terms of procurement is really to focus on trying to reduce total landed costs. So you would explore the unit cost of the item, transportation, inventory, handling, duties, cost of financing. You look at all of those possibilities to find ways to reduce costs. In terms of innovative products, The emphasis should be on reducing the lead time so that you could have quicker response, and also that you are able to be a lot more flexible. All right. So sourcing close to the market area allows for shorter transportation lead times, and then of course air shipments could certainly enable that if you needed to. So if you're trying to determine what is an effective sourcing strategy for components, you could combine Fisher's framework, which focuses on finished goods on the demand side, or Krajic's framework, which focuses on the supply side. If you combine the two frameworks together, you could certainly build an effective approach to determine what is the right procurement strategy. So the integrated framework would focus on identifying how accurate the forecasts are, what kind of supplier risk we face, the financial impact of the product in terms of its profitability or contribution to profit, and then how fast the product actually changes in terms of its clock speed, because you use all that information to help classify the products. In terms of an approach, well, you have companies like HP have pioneered what we call a portfolio strategy. Rather than dealing with a single supplier for a single sort of a procurement contract, they actually use a combination of contracts. So we see here, for example, in terms of flash memory, when that particular product emerged on the market, there's a fair amount of demand uncertainty. The price and the supply was also uncertain, and it posed a huge financial supply risk. So HP committed to purchase large amounts, which basically meant that when they were not sold, they became obsolescent. Why? Because the clock speed of the item is very high. Those things change very quickly. You could buy a flash memory with maybe 1 gigabyte, and then before you know it, you have 2 gigabytes. Before you know it, 5 gigabytes, 10 gigabytes, and so on, 30 gigabytes. So those products were changing very quickly, which made earlier products very obsolete very quickly. So HP's solution was a portfolio strategy to combine fixed commitment where we commit to a certain quantity, but however use some option contracts on part of the demand to satisfy the demand, as well as doing some spot purchasing in case there are some stockouts. Of course, in terms of spot purchasing, then you run into a situation where there's that possibility that you pay a premium for the product because, of course, you're buying on the spot. Last but not least, we're going to talk a bit about e-procurement, essentially electronic procurement, using the internet. So with the advent of the internet, it has enabled businesses now to really establish different opportunities around procurement. So in the late 90s, we saw a sort of an emergence of this phenomenon where B2B automation was a main trend that could actually have a good impact on supply chain management. And of course, it's largely because the internet allowed for very quick transfer of information, or it allowed people to come together or facilitated business-to-business relationships in a much more efficient fashion. Okay, so between 1998 and 2000, we saw multiple e-markets emerging, and essentially those e-markets promise greater market reach for buyers and suppliers, reduced procurement costs, more paperless transactions, and so forth. Because in the 90s, and of course even now, manufacturers were looking to improve outsourcing opportunities. They were looking for expertise. B2B transactions were growing at fairly large rates. The marketplace was highly fragmented in terms of business-to-business transactions. A large number of suppliers competing in the same marketplace offering similar products. So there were opportunities to try to find ways to lower procurement costs. And so e-marketplaces certainly provided an opportunity for that. So what's the value proposition that e-marketplaces or e-procurement actually offered to potential buyers? Well, one is to serve as an intermediary between the buyers and the suppliers, provide a portal. And then it can be used to then identify opportunities for increasing savings, potentially bring in several suppliers together to get them involved in a bidding process, because the sort of technology and software makes that possible, and identifying, qualifying, and supporting suppliers who could then become part of this e-marketplace. And then, of course, facilitating the whole bidding process. So what did we see as some of the results? Reduction in procurement costs from 15 to 40% reduction. Buyers focus on spot market or on leverage components. Basically, you could do a lot more spot market buying because now you have a lot of suppliers brought together in one place, in an e-marketplace, right? It turns out now that there's a de-emphasis on long-term relationships. But to the suppliers themselves, it's not exactly clear whether or not they will derive benefit, because essentially what you have is this technology is bringing a whole lot of them together to compete. And it may very well be that, survival of the fittest. Some do well, some don't do so well. So not every single supplier that is brought into the mix necessarily benefits from that arrangement. So benefits of e-markets to suppliers: relatively small suppliers can expand their market horizon. So if you're small and you're not brought into the marketplace, certainly you may have access to some large buyers. Allow suppliers to access spot markets, and this is good when you have markets that are highly fragmented, and it does help to reduce your market and sales costs because all the suppliers are right there and available for buyers to take a look at. So you don't have to actually need to go and expend a whole lot of marketing dollars to raise awareness of the products and services that you have. And then it allows the suppliers to better utilize their available capacities and inventory by attempting to satisfy or meet the needs of many of these potential buyers. Okay. We could ask a number of questions as to whether or not it's really worth it. Do the benefits compensate for reduction in revenue? Because with greater competition, usually these suppliers have to lower their costs. Many suppliers may not feel comfortable competing on price alone, because this kind of technology really encourages a lot of price-based competition. And suppliers with branding recognition may actually resist selling their services for e-market. Somehow they might figure that that is an affront to their brand image, so they may not necessarily get involved with it. So what about the e-markets themselves? Well, clearly they make money from this sort of arrangement. They get money through transaction costs, typically somewhere between 1% and 5% of the price paid by the buyer. In some cases, you do have some resistance where sellers decide that they don't want to pay a company whose main objective is to drive down their own costs. Or you have a case where the e-marketer will have to have a sort of very flexible kind of a revenue model where they target the people who are highly motivated to be part of this arrangement. And so those folks will be more likely to pay. And then you have also buyers who will say, well, listen, I'm already paying a fee, plus I got to pay the purchase price of the item. So are they really getting a benefit when they add the fee to the price of the item? In a case like this, because there's low barriers to entry in this fragmented market, e-marketers have to really make sure that they offer value to buyers and suppliers. There's also the way in which they charge their clients. That is also having to change. So now some of them are just licensing clients, and in some cases a subscription fee to the service can be charged. So the fee might actually vary depending on the type of market, but also the size of the company, number of employees who use the system, and the sort of annual number of purchase orders. So these are factors that will determine what kind of subscription levels that one would get with the e-marketer. Of course, because the market is fragmented and then there are low barriers to entry, an e-marketer have to sort of evolve their value proposition and offer something more. So there are now 4 types of markets that have been created in terms of expanding or evolving e-marketplaces. And so they consider expanding the value proposition by maybe offering to manage inventory, doing some supply chain planning, offering some financial support, etc. So we have companies like Instill.com focuses on the food service industry and provides an infrastructure that links together operators. And additional services include helping to forecast, manage collaborations, offering some replenishment tools. PIFA.com services the European fresh fish market, offers buyers access to a large number of independent fresh fish auctions, provide visibility on the price for many European ports so that you could actually see what's going on, and provide information on the quality of the product as well. So adding more value to the buyers as a result. You have another type of market called private e-markets. So in a case like this, many companies have established their own private e-markets. So a group of other companies could come together to run reverse auctions or to do some online supply negotiations. So now this is really the buyers actually coming and creating their own e-market to support themselves. So Subway is an example that has 16,000 members in 70 countries. So they allow different restaurants to purchase from over 100 suppliers. So by consolidating that, so they create their own market just for Subway. And so this is an example of a private market. Another one is called a consortia-based e-market. It's kind of similar to public e-markets. But a number of companies that are within the same industry actually decide to come together. And so the companies have to be a member of the consortia, or the consortium, if you wish. So you have Corvus Int, as an example, in the automotive industry, ExoStar in the aerospace industry, Trade Ranger in the oil industry, Converge and E2Open in the electronic industry. So these are examples of consortia-based e-markets, right? So what they do essentially is that these companies need to be serviced, but they provide these suppliers with a common platform with which to do business with them. And then you have content-based e-markets. In this case, you have 2 types. One that has that you have an e-market for maintenance repair operations. So that's one kind, and an industry-specific products. If you're in the oil industry, the automotive industry, etc. So the content is determined by the kind of industry. So there's focus on content achieved by integrating catalogs from many industrial suppliers. It sort of unifies their catalogs in some way, because if all of the suppliers want to participate, it might actually help them if they do some standardization. And it provides some effective tools for searching and comparing suppliers' products. So in summary, we know that outsourcing has benefits and risks. Companies need frameworks to be able to assist them to make decisions. Fisher came up with a framework for innovative versus functional products. You have projects framework for making procurement decisions. And then we see now in terms of e-marketplaces, multiple types of e-markets depending on the types of industries and the nature of the competitive environment. So a lot of the different types of e-markets will depend on the nature of the products that are being sought, the power of the buyers, the power of the suppliers, and the ability of the e-marketer to add value to both the suppliers and the buyers.